not, I'm going to have to do this completely from memory, so that's going to be interesting. The first thing I'd like to ask though is, can I get a show of the hands who in the room is not vegan? Right, 2. And so everyone else in the room is vegan or transitioning to vegan? Right, okay, that's all right. It's just that a large part of this talk will be based around the idea of veganism as a compassionate lifestyle. So I always like to get an idea for whether I'm sort of preaching to the choir. I've gotten halfway through talks before and realised that I'm trying to convince a room full of vegans to go vegan. So this talk is heavily based around veganism. You'll have noticed by the name of the talk that it does not say vegan in the name. It's titled Living Compassionately. And the reason for that is that the general reason that most people tend to go vegan is because they are looking to live more in line with their moral and ethical beliefs. So the general idea of veganism for a lot of people is that it's a moral baseline. It's somewhere to start off when it comes to kindness to animals. It's not the only thing we can do, and there's a lot of other things we can do. This talk is not a talk trying to convince you to go vegan. This talk is simply a talk on ethics and on how we can understand the world in which we live in and understand how to live in a way that benefits the people and the creatures that we share it with. So obviously a large part of that will be to do with veganism, but there will be some other things that I'll be bringing up too. Now, since my laptop isn't up, I'm going to get my notes on my phone. This will be interesting. Right. So, my first slide is supposed to be entitled, "What does it mean to be a good person?" So, if we could get some hands up, does anyone have any just general idea of what it means to be a good person? Little things that you would see in other people and think that makes them a good person or not a good person? Kind. Kind, right? Anyone else? Yeah?
Don't want to cause harm.
Don't want to cause harm to other people. Okay, that's good.
Thoughtfulness.
Thoughtfulness. Okay. Kind, compassionate. By a show of hands, how many people in the room that think that human beings are intrinsically good? More of the time than not, who thinks that human beings are usually good? Okay. And who thinks that human beings are, generally speaking, selfish and bad? Okay? And is there anyone that's in the middle on that? Yeah. So I think that the important thing to highlight there is that most people generally think that human beings are shades of grey, and that there's a little of both in all of us. And and one of the problems with today's society is that we live in a world in which people want to paint black and white. They want to say this person has done this thing that makes them bad, this person has done this thing that makes them good. And more often we get to hero worshipping celebrities and we find out the detail of their lives and we think, oh, I don't like that, that person is now a bad person, not recognising that everyone has shades of grey in all of them. And the only way that we can seek to live more compassionately and be more aligned with being a good person is to, instead of projecting that judgment out towards other people, is to reflect it inwards, think about what our standards are for being good and apply them more to ourselves. As a result of this, the vegan and animal rights movement has a bit of a reputation for being judgmental. We hear a lot of the time, it's okay if you want to be vegan, I respect your choice to be vegan, but you need to respect my choice to do whatever I want. and this general idea that everyone is a hypocrite, everyone does things that are wrong, so we can't judge others. I'm here to challenge that today. Certain parts of this, you may decide you want to disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine. We are going to have a chance for questions and comments at the end, so unless I project something towards you, I encourage you to say that to the end, but you don't have to completely agree with me. But I am looking to sort of challenge some parts of people's perceptions on what it means to be good and what judgment is. We live in sort of a world now where a lot of people perceive judging others to be a fundamentally bad thing, and that a lot of people will say, oh well, I don't like to judge, I do my thing but I don't like to judge. But for some reason we only apply that to certain things. A lot of people will apply that to political beliefs, and a lot of people will apply that to diets. But when it comes to things that intrinsically affect us, or that we have a strong link to, suddenly that perception goes away. So, if someone has come in and killed a member of your family, or assaulted a lover, then the idea that judgment is fundamentally a bad thing suddenly disappears. And we decide that that person is fundamentally bad because of the decisions that they have made. And the reason for that is because they affect us and those around us. So the whole premise of veganism is expanding that circle to other creatures, to other beings, to everyone we share the planet with, without judgment, without link on who we have a personal connection with. And that includes both humans and animals. Does anyone know what the definition of veganism is? Anyone have an idea of what veganism sort of means to them?
Doing everything you can to do least harm.
Yes, that is a pretty spot-on definition for veganism. The official Vegan Society definition of veganism is doing everything practicable and possible to avoid the exploitation and harm of animals / other beings. A lot of people make the assumption that that means that veganism is entirely based around animals. But there's two important things to note there. The first is that the whole premise of veganism is not putting ourselves above other life forms and stating that our taste pleasure and our convenience and our tradition are no reason to take the lives away from another being. So the whole premise of removing that speciesist gap that we are different and recognising that from a biological sense we would all be categorised as animals. There's human and non-human animals. So when you think about it being the exploitation of other beings, that includes humans. You think about animals, humans are just another species of animal. What a lot of people don't recognize, I'm sure everyone in this room is probably very much aware that veganism is seeking to cut down your harm of animals. You're cutting out their flesh from your diet. You're also cutting out their secretions from milk. You're cutting out their fur, anything that's been tested on them. So anything that's directly linked to animals. But what a lot of people don't realise is how fundamentally that affects the human race as well. So that's something that I want to talk very quickly about, is animal ag, which is short for animal agriculture, versus humans. Because this is an industry that's been built up over many, many generations and is fundamentally and intrinsically linked with the exploitation of both humans and non-human animals. What a lot of people don't realise is that in the modern world, we breed about 60 billion land animals every year for human consumption. Now those land animals, mostly cows, chickens and pigs. Cows and pigs require an incredible amount of crop feed to feed them and to grow them up to the size that we want them to be, to get the most meat out of them. Those animals exist purely on a sort of plant-based diet and a herbivorous diet. So over 2/3 of the crops that we grow currently in the world are fed to livestock for Western consumption. Most of those crops are grown in the developing world. The majority of soy crops, I think it's close to 80%, I'm not sure the exact number, is fed to livestock and not to humans. And the second biggest thing that soy is used for is actually biofuel. The consumption of soy for human consumption is actually very, very small. The same can be said for palm. We talk a lot about palm oil. The majority of palm either goes into fuel or into livestock feed. And the same goes for oats, for corn, for a whole load of the biggest monoproduced plant crops. It is the largest cause of deforestation, the largest cause of the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, and it is the largest cause of land usage. So we pay lower class, struggling workers in the developing world to grow food that they can't take home to their families, but instead is shipped across to be fed to livestock for Western consumption. So even when we're talking about buying local and free range, and even grass-fed, because the grass-fed cattle are only fed grass for a portion of the year. In the winter and autumn months they're kept inside. A large part of their diet is food that could be used for people in the developing world. There is a lady that I'd like to quickly talk about called Dorothy. Let me just double check the spelling of his name. I think it is Dorothy Stang, but if you look up non-activist Brazil, you'll find out who she is. She is just one name among many, but I choose to talk about her because she is a pacifist, and she has direct ties to towards a lot of peaceful and activist movements. But she is just a figurehead. Dorothy Stang is an environmental protester. She is a nun who went over to Brazil to protest the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, and she was shot dead by hired guns who were paid for by the cattle industry. She's one of about, that I know of from the news, about 60 different activists, most of whom were locals from Brazil who have been killed by hired guns that were shown to be paid by either the crop production industry or cattle ranchers or other large-scale industries. And the reason that I bring her up is simply to put a name on it. I can throw out a lot of numbers and statistics. I can tell you how many people have been killed, but putting a name on it, for one, gives people something that they can go home and research and look into it, but also ties it to being something more personal. So this industry, even though the majority of people are against deforestation, even though the majority of people are for climate activists, we still pay huge amounts of money to crop up an industry that is based on exploitation, that is exploiting entire cultures, and that is actually having people killed who choose to stand up against them. And the reason we don't hear about this is because it's not happening here, it's not happening back home, so it's not considered a big thing. If a white protester was shot dead in the UK, I think it would be all over the national news, but because it happened in Brazil, we don't really hear about it. Which brings me on to the second topic, which is something that's talked about a little bit in environmental communities, but is not something that most people have heard about, which is something called environmental racism. And this is the idea that large-scale industries that are destroying the planet are directly targeting lower class areas and particularly targeting minority communities. So what a lot of people don't know is that when factory farms and slaughterhouses are being built, these companies usually go for lower class areas and communities to place these giant, essentially factories pushing through animal products because they have a huge pollutive effect on the environment. There was a headline a couple of years ago about one of the world's largest pig farms in North Carolina that was so heavily polluting the African American neighborhood that the rates of asthma, heart disease and cancer had gone up by several 100% in their children. Their schools were only sort of half an hour drive away from this farm that was sending huge amounts of pollution and factory farm runoff into the local community. This is not an isolated incident, this happens all over the Western world. Not only do we place our crop production in developing countries, we place our factory farms and slaughterhouses in lower class neighbourhoods that often immigrants have been forced to move into because they can't afford anywhere else and they're not really welcomed anywhere else. Then, Western governments put a huge amount of pressure on refugees and people without jobs who have fled other countries to work in factory farms and slaughterhouses. Both America, Canada and Australia were more likely to allow refugees into their countries if they signed up to work in slaughterhouses and factory farms. The reason for that was because they were struggling to find anyone in their own communities who was willing to do that work. The conditions in factory farms and slaughterhouses had become so dire, the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anxiety, as well as suicidal thoughts, had gone up several 100% in the people that were working there. So they couldn't find anyone from their local communities to work in these places. And they basically pressured through coercion immigrants and refugees who were fleeing war zones that effectively we had created into working in these environments because no one else would do it. These are all things that you can look up online. They've been reported by various different news outlets, but of course they're never front page news, they're never heavily talked about because it's not something that directly affects our culture. Does anyone know what intersectionality is? Big word. So, it's spelled like this. Sorry for my heavy reliance on the whiteboard. Intersectionality is the idea that all discrimination is linked. The idea that oppressors of one group are more likely to oppress another group. This was originally discovered, this concept was originally coined by a group of black women working in factories who were trying to sue the corporation they worked for discrimination based on the fact that they had poorer working conditions and lower wages because they were women. The company came back and said, we can't possibly be paying you less because you're women or treating you differently because you're women, because look at these white women that we're employing that we treat perfectly fine, they're paid better, so it must be that you're poor workers. So they tried to sue them again based on the idea that they were being discriminated against because they were black. And the company said, we can't possibly be discriminating against you because you're black, because look at these black men that we employ who are making more money than you, who are have better working conditions. So it must be just that you're bad workers. And the concept was developed that actually discrimination was linked, and that certain levels of privilege exist in different groups that make them less likely to be targeted, and that someone who is likely to oppress and bully one group is likely to oppress and bully others. What a lot of people don't realise is that the concentration camps that were used in Germany during the war were based on concentration camps that the British set up in the Boer War. So we put this heavy criticism on the Nazis and the Germans for killing thousands and thousands of people in these horrible concentration camps when we were doing exactly the same thing in the Boer War. And that's where they learnt the idea from, and forcing these people into these cramped conditions. Well, in the Boer War, those internment camps, there are notes from the army generals and from the higher-ups within government who had them set up. They were heavily based on the first factory farms. They were treating these natives and indigenous people like animals. They saw them as animals, so they decided to treat them the same way that they were treating animals. A lot of the companies and corporations that were involved in this exploitation, this slave trade, and all of this fundamental oppression were just taking the exploitation that they were already doing on animals and stretching it out and using it on humans. So the idea that all social justice interconnects, and the people who are oppressing one group are more likely to be oppressing other groups as well, is something that is historically documented. So, we've talked about how the crop farming is causing huge amounts of deforestation. The lower class workers in developing countries who are growing our crops are unable to feed their own families on the wages we pay them for that. The factory farms and slaughterhouses employ refugees and lower class people who have incredibly high rates of mental health conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anxiety. I'm sure most of you in this sort of current world know the intrinsic links between animal agriculture and global warming. It's talked about quite a lot at the moment. Animal agriculture is the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions, including nitrous oxide and methane, which are more potent and powerful than CO2, and CO2 emissions, which linger in the environment for longer, causing longer lasting detrimental effects. It's more than the entire transportation sector combined. They're the leading cause of deforestation and also oceanic dead zones. So we talk a lot about overfishing, but there's also this talk about all the plastic and waste that's in the ocean. Places doing things like banning plastic straws, which is great, which make up about 0.0000000 recurring 1% of the waste in the ocean. The majority of pollution and waste in the ocean is discarded fishing gear and runoff from factory farms that are placed on coasts. If the sea life dies, then that has a detrimental effect on the rest of the planet. So we know about all of this stuff. For that reason, there's a lot of people saying now that you cannot be an environmentalist and not be vegan. It's kind of like going around trying to convince other people to turn off all the leaky taps in their house, whilst in the garden a dam has broken and is flooding the entire neighbourhood. These things are good things to deal with and address, but if you're not dealing with the larger root of the problem first, then you're essentially plugging tiny little pinholes into a giant flood that you're never gonna stop. So these are all arguments as to how going vegan helps you to live in line with your sort of compassionate, moral and ethical views. We know that consuming animal products harms animals. Most people now are aware that even in the dairy and egg industries there's huge amounts of exploitation. All of these animals end up in the same slaughterhouses and actually are kept in worse confined conditions, and the males in the dairy and the egg industry actually are killed far earlier than in the meat industry. So we know the intrinsic links between these animal products and their effect on animals. What a lot of you might not have been aware is their effects also on human populations and on the environment. What I haven't really talked about is why becoming an activist makes you a better person. I said at the beginning of the talk that the whole idea that judgment is wrong and that we shouldn't judge others is fundamentally flawed. Everyone makes everyday judgments, literally everywhere they go. Now, some people take that judgment a little bit too liberally. I'm going to judge that woman because she's wearing a particularly revealing outfit. That has absolutely no impact on me. I'm going to judge that. I'm going to judge that a man because he's working on a Sunday and I'm a strict Christian and believe that's wrong. But it's having no impact on me. So, when it comes to judgment, we tend to think that if it has an impact on us, it becomes valid. If you're hurting someone that you know or you love or yourself, then that suddenly becomes okay. You're allowed to judge others for bullying, you're allowed to judge others for homophobia, prejudice, you're allowed to judge others for stealing, for assault. And the principle of veganism is just extending that to animals. If we walk down the street and we saw a gang of people beating a dog to death, most of us would immediately make a snap judgment that those people were bad. We might make a decision to intervene or to call the police. But generally speaking, we make a judgment that that's bad. But when it's happening in an institution behind closed doors, and we feel like there are government regulations in place to make sure that the death and exploitation of these animals happens in the nicest way possible, it suddenly comforts us a little bit more. Even those of us that are vegan, even myself, will happily sit down with our non-vegan friends and watch them buy the burger and the steak and not say anything about it. We might even stick up for them if another sort of more extreme vegan were to come in and start yelling at them. I'm guilty of saying, oh, well, this friend actually, they're trying really hard and they're making an effort, even though 4 years down the line they haven't gone vegan. And it is hard to break through that idea. A lot of us deal with this sort of mental block when we go vegan. It's called cognitive dissonance, which is when your actions don't align with your beliefs. When you are doing something that fundamentally goes against what you believe to be right, you hit this mental block where your brain just goes into a loop of denial and excuses. But we can also do that with other people. It's really hard to acknowledge this thought that everyone around us is doing something that we fundamentally think to be evil and wrong, because the logical step from that might be to think that those people are fundamentally evil and wrong. But as we said at the beginning, most of us recognise that life is shades of grey. And just because you recognise that something someone is doing is wrong, and that you want to speak up about it, doesn't mean you have to cut them out of your life completely. But inaction is complicity, and every time that we sit there and we allow someone to make these purchases, make these decisions without saying anything, we become complicit in it. They suddenly have this idea that actually it might be okay, because the other fundamental ideas we have, if one of our friends were to be abusing their partner, were to be cruel to a homeless person, if we would see them make a homophobic comment, most of us would feel really uncomfortable and call them out. And they would know, oh, my friend doesn't like what I'm doing now. They would recognise that. But when we don't call them out when it comes to their dietary and lifestyle choices, we hit this block of them going, well, they're not calling me out, so it can't be as bad as those other things. It can't be as intrinsically wrong. And so that's what activism is about. There's a scenario that someone presented me with recently, which was there's a couple of drivers driving down a road, and one of the drivers decides to, they see a whole load of animals crossing the road. One of the drivers decides to plough through the animals, regardless of how many of those animals are injured. And the other driver decides to stop and wait. And that question is presented to people with, so which one of those drivers do you think would be vegan, and which one of them do you think would be a meat eater? I'm not going to patronise you by asking you to give me an answer, because it's clear that I'm leaning towards the fact that the driver who stops is a vegan, and the driver who ploughs on through is the meat eater. But if you look at that scenario as an actual real thing rather than a hypothetical, it becomes a bit more bizarre, because the other driver is just sat there watching it. They're sort of patting themselves on the back for not choosing to plough through these animals. And vegans can tend to get a bit on their high horse by saying, think of all the animals' lives that I've saved by going vegan. But we haven't really saved any animals' lives at all. Those are the animals that would have been killed by our choices anyway. And any time that a vegan sort of gets on their high horse and says, well, I'm saving animals' lives, those animals may have managed to go on living because you chose not to plough your car through them, but you haven't saved their life at all. You've just, by inaction, you've decided not to harm them. So an activist would be the person who stops their car, gets out of the car, and stops the other driver from ploughing through the animals. They may do that by trying to convince them to stop. They may do that by placing themselves between the animals and the car. There are various different methods that they might pick, but the activist is someone who actively chooses, regardless of their own safety, regardless of how awkward it is getting out in the middle of a busy road and waving your arms around like a lunatic, is the person that makes that decision to do that and to not only not harm the animals themselves, but also put themselves out there. Activism comes in all sorts of different forms, whether it's giving money to a homeless person, or turning up to an environmental protest, or signing a petition, or sharing a post on social media. There's all sorts of ways that we can make an impact. But veganism is not a path of action. We're not doing anything by picking up a different option on the shelf. We've not made any action by choosing not to order the chicken nuggets or the cow's milk and the latte. It's a path of inaction. It's deciding I'm not going to do something. Activism is a path of action. It's deciding not only am I not going to contribute to this, but I'm going to do the things that I see that I can fundamentally do to stop that. And there's multiple different strategies that people use to be an activist. Does anyone have any examples that they can think of everyday activism? So I'm not thinking here marching into a slaughterhouse and putting yourself in front of the machinery, or breaking or picking up chickens and carrying them out. I'm talking about everyday things that people can do to make the world a better place. It doesn't have to be for humans. Does anyone have any examples? Yeah?
You can always, well, I do, is have stickers that says I ate here because there was a vegan option.
Nice.
And put them.
Right, so stickering has become really positive in the modern world because you don't have to confront anyone, you don't have to get into awkward conversations, but it's something that someone sees when they're walking along, they see, and that suddenly puts words in their mind. It's a subconscious thing. People also do chalking, or pay for billboards to be put up, or share posts on social media. And this idea of normalising causing no harm, this idea of constantly confronting people with the reality of their decisions. So we generally recognise that most people go vegan when they're confronted with the reality of how these industries work. And that's happening more and more now. More and more people are being confronted. Vegans are on the news more companies are doing vegan options. The word vegan is everywhere, and that confronts people with the fact that there is an alternative and why people are going vegan. So it can be as simple. You don't have to be going around and telling people, oh, you're wrong and I can't sit with you if you're eating meat. That might be an effective way to get through to people, but you don't have to do that. As long as you are constantly doing everything you can to confront people with the reality of their decisions, that is a form of activism. So I work for an organisation called Oxford Vegan Action. We do street outreach approximately once a month. All we do is hand out leaflets and occasionally food samples and talk to people about why we're vegan and ask them questions and see what their perceptions of veganism is. We're not attacking anyone, we're not forcing anyone to do anything, we're just trying to raise a bit of awareness. There are more extreme organisations like the Hunt Saboteurs who go out and actively try and prevent fox hunts. There are organisations that you can fund like Sea Shepherd, which go out and try and stop the overfishing. Every single area in which there is currently exploitation going on, there are these companies that can help. There's homeless outreach groups, there's Extinction Rebellion, there's all these different organisations. But if we seek to become an activist and if we seek to try and make the world a better place, but we haven't addressed the biggest causes of those issues within our own life. If we're going out there and we're talking the talk, but we're still buying cow's milk in our latte, we're signing all of the petitions, but we're still eating cheese on our pizzas, we're still fundamentally contributing to all of these things that we claim that we disagree with, the horrible things that are going on in the third world, the rise in mental health issues, the oppression of lower classes, the treatment of refugees, and the destruction of the environment. These are all things that we continue to pay for. We live in a capitalist society that is based on supply and demand. These companies will keep doing these things if we keep paying them. But if we show them that actually there's no money in it, that's all they're built on. They're built on making money, so they will switch. We're starting to run out of time now. Does anyone have any questions? I'm sorry that this has been a little bit rambly. My format has been thrown off by the fact that I couldn't get the projector to work. But hopefully I've covered all the bases. Does anyone have any questions or even comments, anything they think I said that they'd like to add to? Or
I think it's been really interesting to
Yeah.
talk. And I'm not vegan myself, but I do think the world would be a better place with all vegans.
right.
But I think it's difficult to say, you know, I actually do think it's better that people do, well, not better that people do things in increments. If people can go from meat eater to vegan, that's great,
Yeah.
but most people can't. Like people's lifestyle choices are quite complex. So I think, yeah, so people doing things in increments is just as good in a way. Maybe not just as good, but it's more more available to a lot of people than saying you
Yes.
have to go vegan. So,
Yeah.
do you
I see what
I
you're
mean?
saying, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a question that I get a
But
lot.
yeah.
And the first thing that I always say is, I didn't go vegan overnight. So it would be hypocritical of me to stand here and tell everyone that they need to make this change overnight. The state of the world that we're getting into, it would be great if everyone could, but just about every vegan that I know didn't do it overnight, and there are some that did, and I have a huge amount of respect for them. One thing that I would say is that although nearly every vegan I know didn't do it overnight, the thing that they all seem to say is it was far easier than they thought it was, and they wished that they had done it sooner. They wished that they had. I decided that I was going to go vegan right before I went on a road trip across Central Asia and the Middle East, and I kind of went, right, I'm not going to be able to eat anything over there, so I'll deal with it when I get back. And then as I was going across these countries, I started to realise actually every culture has fundamental plant-based cooking. And actually, Westernised cultures have the highest rates of animal product consumption. And then when I got back home, the obstacles that I encountered back home seemed so much smaller. I have the advantage that I love to cook, but there are a lot of misconceptions, like vegan food is more expensive. It doesn't have to be. My family switched over to plant-based a couple of years ago. We're a family of 7, and our monthly food bills went down quite significantly. There are fundamental things that some people will feel hold them back more than others, and every single person is different. And there are these people who will tell you that everyone can go vegan. I always point to the definition of veganism, which is avoiding the exploitation of and harm of other beings to the greatest degree practicable and possible, which would suggest that if you're doing everything that you can, you are still vegan. But I find that everyone is always surprised actually by how much they can do. And it is just about taking that leap and making those adjustments. There's a huge community now online which really helps. There's a lot of vegan support groups, specifically built for some people who are transitioning that have in their rules that it's a judgment-free space and it's simply to help people. So I do recognise the advantage of baby steps, but I also recognise that a lot of people end up saying, oh yeah, I'm transitioning, and 4 years down the line are still transitioning. So having a clear idea, keeping motivated, communicating with other vegans, I think, is important in keeping those end goals in line. But it would be hypocritical of me to say, no, you need to get vegan overnight, because I know very few people who did that. So, any other questions quickly before we finish off? Yeah?
What do you think is the single biggest reason for why people are still actively not going vegan? It's conversations I'm having. I don't know if it's around the education around it. People aren't seeing stuff that's going on in the underdeveloped world, or is it because of branding and marketing around vegans, or?
Right, so there's a whole number of factors that contribute, like some of the things that you've talked about, but every study that has been done has fundamentally shown that the biggest obstacle that we face is cognitive dissonance, is the idea, people sort of putting up these excuses in their heads and refusing to, this sort of mental block of refusing to acknowledge in their own heads that their actions are not aligned with their beliefs. So they convince themselves that there are ethical ways to create animal products. And the facts that they're given, they convince themselves that they're biased and that they come from vegan propaganda agencies and stuff like that. The biggest obstacle really is, and that's intrinsically linked, I think, to the way that people are brought up. There's a lot of tradition and convenience. This is the whole way that we've built our entire lifestyles. So it's hard to get over that mental block. But just about every study I've read says that you look at every single culture, no matter what their differences are in that culture, the biggest obstacle is literally just the psychological mental block of, oh, I don't think I could do it, oh, I'd be sick if I did it, oh, no, these products aren't as bad, just the mental blocks that people put up. That are contributed to by education. Doctors, for example, have like 2 weeks worth of nutritional training, and unless they go on to do further nutritional qualifications or specialise, your standard GP actually knows very little about diet. So they hear things from their GP and they think, oh, that reaffirms what I was saying, without actually doing any of their own research, because a lot of the time they're scared that research will. So it's, honestly, I would say mental blocks contributed to through education. Right, I think we've sort of run out of time there. We do have a stand downstairs that I will be out for a little while longer, but also we have other volunteers from Oxford Vegan Action who can answer any questions that you have. Or, or if you follow Oxford Vegan Action on Facebook, you can always just message us any questions or concerns you have. Like I say, we're a non-confrontational group and we are here to help people make those changes. So feel free to message us anything, come along to our events, just get involved with the community. Thank you.
Thank you.